thank you, members of the press, for joining us this afternoon. Really what we wanted to do here is give you an opportunity to visit with us and give our side of kind of where we think things are. In the recent weeks, we've been hearing a lot out of the governor's office about the need for a special session, declining state revenues, tax increases, on and on and on. So we'd like to give you our perspective on what's that. So first of all, I think most of you veterans understand, how the state budgeting process works, and I'm not going to get too wonky. Frankly, I've got two appropriations and finance and claims chairs here to do that for me. But from 30,000 feet, we set the next 2 years state budget based on revenue forecasts, what we think the state is going to take in tax dollars in the next 2 years, and that's how we build our budget for the next plan. What we've seen is that since we left Helena, since the legislature adjourned in late April, we had adopted a revenue estimate based on the latest numbers we got from our nonpartisan legislative fiscal staff. As soon as we left town, the governor basically took our revenue estimate, wadded it up, threw it in the trash, and used his own revenue estimate numbers that come out of his budget office. And those are the numbers that the governor's office has been promulgating, pushing for tax increases and a special session. Again, from 30,000 feet, I'll speak for House leadership. I don't want to speak for Senate leadership. The majority leader can do that. But a special session to raise revenues or to cut state government is not a given here. As I said, the governor is using his own budget numbers. We're only 3 months into the state fiscal year. We're set to get a revenue update in November. And at that point, we're going to have some income tax and property tax revenues starting to roll into the state, and we should have a better idea of what the state financial picture is from our nonpartisan staff. So at this point, I think it's certainly premature to talk about the necessity of a special session, particularly if we're talking about raising taxes to fix what we don't even know for sure is a budget problem. Now, it could very well be that the governor's numbers are right. We all do our best here to take an educated guess at what we think the revenue is going to be. We base ours on our nonpartisan staff's forecasts that come from a variety of sources. The governor's office does the same. And I'll grant it's been a tough year. Ag prices are down, commodities are down, natural resource prices are down, and we had a severe drought throughout the state. It didn't just affect forest fires in western Montana. I can tell you this is probably the worst agricultural year that my part of the state, northeastern Montana, probably the worst year we've had in probably 25 or 30. So it could very well be that tax revenues are going to be down, but what I'm simply saying is at this point, we don't know that for sure. We're set to get updated numbers next month. If the numbers do come in low, what I will say is that the governor has tools at his disposal to address budget shortfalls. We don't need to be talking about raising taxes on Montanans in a down economic year. The governor has at his disposal the authority to make budget cuts where necessary. I would simply say that the proposed cuts he has put out there in the media and other places are designed to be very graphic cuts in services to boots on the ground, and there's very little cuts to any if at all bureaucracy in Helena, and that's an issue for us. The fire fund might need to be addressed, but that's a separate issue. I mean, we all can agree that there was a bad fire year, probably the worst we've seen in 30 years. There was a lot of acres that burned, and as a result, we went through the entire biennium budget for the fire fund, plus some. The governor had some authority to make some fund transfers, and again, I'll let the experts talk about that. But the fire fund may indeed need to be addressed for next year. If we have another bad fire season, obviously we need to be ready for that. But in my mind, that is a wholly separate issue then do we need to come into special session and talk about raising taxes or implementing further budget cuts? From my perspective, the governor has all the authority he needs to do that right now. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Majority Leader Senator Thomas.
As the Speaker said, this isn't a time for us to be considering whether we would come into a legislative session that could take several weeks to deal with the general fund shortfall, if that's the case. And as we did when we left the session in April, the Finance and Appropriations Committee, led by Senator Jones, had set up the Budget Stabilization Act. And towards the end of for the first time, we'd have a rainy day fund for the first time in this state. We do now. And towards the end of the session, there was more concern about potential softness in revenue. So there was a set of cuts negotiated with the governor's office and the legislature that was set into that same bill that set up the Stabilization Act. Unfortunately, those were all triggered, and they amounted to about $64 million in cuts, $33 million in transfers. So now, with the governor's office feeling more revenue will not come in than this level that was happened in July, that was kind of accounted for in July of this year. With that further numbers, that they're really the only ones that have the real direct access to these numbers. Our process is that we give the governor the authority to reduce expenditures by another 10% of what he has access to. And that's what really needs to be done by the governor now, is just to use his authority that's granted in law, like every other governor has in the past, and make the reductions that he thinks are best for the state at this time. Now, as the Speaker said, we're hoping that in doing so, the governor will take the heaviest light to not taking those out on people in need across Montana, which I think the Speaker said, some of these cuts that are proposed are kind of seem wrong-headed and backwards versus making reductions in the bureaucracy in Helena. Seems like the reductions that he's proposing protect Helena, but not services to the citizens of the state. He'll figure that out if he makes these reductions and does his job. And if he does his job, if the fire fund exceeds the authority to pay the bills, we'll come back and, as timely as possible, fix the statutory authority to pay the fire bills, finish that up, and get out of Dodge, get out of Helena, that is, as quickly as possible. But the mechanisms are all there. We just need the governor to take his rightfully position as governor, which he sought. Nobody forced him into that position, and be the chief executive of the state and deal with the revenue shortfalls that he says are happening now. It's real common. Every governor, I think, in the past has had to do this. He would be the first, maybe not. So, Lou and Nancy, I'll turn it to you guys.
Sure, thanks, Fred. This is Nancy. Lou and I are going to go over some of the specific numbers. Lou will talk more about that. I wanted to talk a little bit about the Legislative Finance Committee meeting that we had last week and some of the comments that we made back to the governor. As you probably, most of you know by now, the state statute 17-7-140 authorizes the governor in times of a projected revenue shortfall. And again, I will emphasize that that's a projected revenue shortfall. We don't have any new data to tell us that will happen. But if the governor's budget office perceives that there may be a revenue shortfall, then the governor's authorized to make cuts to achieve the ending fund balance that's stated in statute, which is 5% of the expenditures over the biennium. And then he has to make enough cuts or get the budget back in structural balance with an ending fund balance that is 6% of expenditures. So that's what we're dealing with. That amounted to $227 million in cuts that had to be identified, and each one of the agencies came up with 10% that they could cut from their various agencies. Having been through this in the private sector, typically what happens is agency or in the case of the private sector, departments or divisions will identify their cuts, but then you kind of have to step back from that and say, okay, it gets us to a number, but then what do we really want to do? So the Legislative Finance Committee's job was to comment on the cuts that had been proposed, and then that's really all we could do was submit our comments. So the committee received thousands of emails, phone calls, postal mail, and then we took about 8 hours worth of testimony on the first day of the meeting. So just to give the public a chance to say to the governor, to the agencies, to the legislature, here are the things that we see that are concerning to us. And following that, then we tried to kind of summarize what we had heard and what we believed as a committee, the things that we agreed on in a bipartisan way, that were things in the governor's proposed reductions that were concerning to us. And that was, first of all, we saw a number of cuts that we believed would have possible impact on services to some of Montana's most vulnerable population. And that was a big concern. The citizens who have been promised services expect those services, and it's part of their health and well-being. We were very concerned about making those particular cuts. In addition to that, there were some that are that help people kind of pull themselves up by their bootstraps and get them started economically, and were kind of early intervention programs that we thought if those were affected, then the long-term detriment to the state could be much bigger than what we would save. We also looked at things that may be a savings to the state but would result in a potential increase to local taxes or things that the local governments would then have to fill in. So we identified those concerns, and then lastly, there were some things that were policies that were put in place, particularly in the corrections area, that were designed to save money over the long term and would require, it would create a specific savings over about a 5-year period. And going back to business as usual, cutting those programs out, while that costs money right now, we would not realize the savings in the future. So we were concerned about making those cuts as well. We summarized those in a letter that went to the governor so that we could voice our concerns there in the Legislative Finance Committee, and that went to the governor on the 5th of October. So at this point, I think I'll turn it over to Lou, and he can go through some of the specific numbers with you.
Yeah, hi, this is Lou. As folks know, I tend to be a numbers guy, so I'll just summarize the numbers. And so what do we actually know versus what do we surmise? We know that the 2017 fiscal year ended in July and was about $75 million below estimate. And that's a fact. We also know that in 3 out of the last 13 years, we've seen growth levels of 13% from this forward. So we know where we ended. We know we ended lower than we expected. We don't know what the growth will be forward. We know generally what caused us to be low. It was income tax, corporate income tax, and that section of the personal income tax that's represented primarily by the LLCs, LLPs, the pass-through corporations, and capital gains. We know there's a fire bill. It was $68.5 million when we were in town for LFC. I'm going to assume that the state share is going to be a number that starts with a 7, a $70 million fire bill. We know that fire bill consumed our entire fire fund that was left, which was $35 million. It consumed our $16 million emergency fund and required that the DNRC transfer some next year monies to this year. So we now know we have $0 to fight fires with or deal with any emergencies the next year. We know that the ability for an executive to spend money on fires is linked to two things, both cash availability and appropriation authority. And the best example I can give there is that Governor Schweitzer called a special session for fires, even though he had a large general fund balance, because challenge. The cash challenge could indeed be real, depending on how revenues do come in. Now, revenue-wise, and the speaker touched on this, we know we're a natural resource state. I was just at a Pat Barkey seminar. We talked about net farm income being off 71%. We know oil is down, royalty payments are down, coal is down. Natural resource-wise, we know our revenues are struggling. We know that we have a leak. I call it the e-commerce leak or the services leak. For instance, South Dakota estimates, because they are a sales tax state, that they're losing about 25% of their capture to an e-commerce penetration. So we know we have some revenue challenges that. We also know that forecasting in a state where the legislature meets every year is challenging. And it's really made challenging in a state that runs solely on income tax, because income tax is variable. So we know the executive took a look at where he's at, and he forecasted that he was $229 million down by 2019. That's his number. That's where he came up with a need to trigger 17.7140. We also know it's a forecast. Now, that doesn't mean it's real. It is possible. It certainly is possible. It may be not entirely the most probable, but it is possible. We know the Gov has tools to deal with this at some level. That's 17.7140. He did, under those tools, he provided a list of $229 million plus in cuts. Now, the list was for review. I would expect he will now select a subset of that list. And because he's challenged for filling these holes. We also know that some of the budget is statutory, K-12, for instance, counties, their payments to counties and cities, and he cannot touch that, but he can touch a certain portion. So I would expect a subset, again, to be provided by the governor of that list. We know that the legislature will ultimately probably have to deal with the fire bill, but again, that's somewhat of a separate issue. Montana smelled the smoke. They knew there was fire. So there's going to be an ongoing discussion, obviously, of how do you deal with the fire bill. One is going to depend what it ends up, and then how do we get there. I tend to be an advocate of some sort of a temporary tax measure, something up and down here. Others are looking to borrow from the coal trust fund. I think that's against the Constitution, but that's all things that can be debated out. And how we get there, I can't reborrowing is transferring the problem forward, not paying the bill. But again, those are all discussion items. How do you deal with a fire bill? So we know that the Gov is going to ultimately soon propose a level of cuts. Out of that 225, what's he going to propose? I'm hoping $100 million-ish number or so. I keep thinking maybe he can get to 50%. Depending what he proposes there, that he will actually do, if that will represent the size of the hole that's left, if there is a hole. And if he follows the approach Schweitzer did, he can directly cut a certain deal. He could potentially propose that the legislature join with him in cuts to the statutory of some number, but that would require the legislature to participate. So at this point, what we know is that the ball is in the governor's court.